Dr. Whitehead is coming in. I see you're here now, and she's coming in from Chicago and Loyola University. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So I'm Dr. K. Wise Whitehead. I'm actually based in Baltimore. I'm at Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore, and I'm the president of the
Oh,
National
yeah.
Student Association. So I am excited, and I want to start by asking you to do another test. I know you just had a test around literacy that I'm not sure if anyone passed. My test is a little bit different, and it's a test I do when I go into the PK through 12th grade environment. I ask students to name 6 Black people that they've heard the most about in their childhood. I said, take a second. I'm going to ask you to do it right now. Those of you who are listening, just take a quick moment, write down 6 Black people that you've heard the most about in your lifetime. And I want to see if the 6 Black people that you wrote down are the same 6 Black people that students all over the country, whenever I ask this question, it's the same 6 Black people over and over again. My topic is freedom, controversy, and respect, our lives, our history. And I just want to weave a tale about the importance of why we should be fighting to keep our history as a part of the national history curriculum, why we should not roll over, why we should not give way. You got that list of 6 Black people? Let me tell you what students all over the country have said. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and Barack Obama. And as a student once told me, she said, I really try to understand American history. This is a 9th grader. She said, in my mind, it's like Harriet Tubman met Dr. King. They got married. They ran away. They caught the bus up north. They jumped the broom. They had a son. His name was Barack Obama, and he became president. And as I started laughing about what she was saying, it stopped me in my tracks. If all we ever teach them is about Black history only during the month of February, then it really is about Harriet Tubman meeting Dr. King, getting married, and they have Barack Obama, because they're collapsing over 400 years of history into 1 month. And now they're trying to get rid of that. Maya Angelou once wrote that the hope that lives in the breast of the Black American is just so tremendous that it overwhelms her sometimes. We have this hope that America will get better, that America will live up to its creed, that America will reach beyond and become more than what it is at this moment. I'm here to tell you, even though we work towards that, it is not happening, and it will not happen until we force them and we make them do it. They will never just give way because of the goodness of their heart. That's not going to happen. As a Black woman, and as I think about our lives and our history, I understand that no matter how fast I run, I cannot outrun my past or our collective history. My life has never been a blank canvas where I could just paint the picture of who I want to be and how I want the world to see me. I was born Black in a white world, and let's be clear, because of that, we have been fighting to be free, to be equal, and really to be unbothered in a country that is intent on stopping us. If you do not fit into the circle of privilege, which means if you are not white, or you're not a man, or you're not classified as being someone who is heterosexual, if you're not cisgender, if you're not able-bodied, if you don't fit into that circle of privilege, then you're fighting to be equal, you're fighting to be free, and you're fighting to be unbothered. America, my great-grandfather would always say, is a racist, wicked place. He said America was a hellhole where if you are Black, there's no beginning and there's no end, it just is. And as a little girl growing up in Ola, South Carolina, my great-grandfather would take me on long walks throughout the woods, and he would always take us to the family cemetery. No matter what direction we started in, we always ended up in the same place. He would walk up and down the rows of the family cemetery, and he would stop and talk about each person buried there, weaving stories of hope and tragedy and resistance and defiance, and the incredible will and deep-rooted sadness that reminded me of who we were in this country. He would go through and he would say, that person over there, that they were lynched because they smiled at a white woman. And that person over there, they died in a car accident because they were driving too fast next to a white person. And that person over there, they were taken off the war and they were brought home and beaten up because they dared to stand up to a white person. And that person over there never even made it home. We just put their name on the headstone. We just assume that the white man took them. This is Olar, South Carolina, learning about race relations at the knee of my great-grandfather. Well, I've been thinking about him a lot over these last couple of months because I'm watching as this country is moving back toward a place where it has become dangerous to talk about our history. It has become dangerous to talk about what's happening in the Latina community. It has become dangerous to talk about what's happening in the LGBTQIA community. Dangerous in the sense that you can lose your job. In some cases, you can lose your freedom. And in rare cases, although it happens, you can potentially lose your life. I was thinking about that in preparation for tonight, and I thought a lot about George Floyd and the fact it's been almost 3 years since the brutal murder of George Floyd, that we've been trying to challenge openly this very racist, white supremacist system. And every time we do, they drag us back. An earlier speaker said that what we saw after the election of President Barack Obama, a turning in this country. I'm making the argument as a historian who looks at 19th century Black American history, it goes back longer than that. This is a long and well thought out plan that's been in place. And what we see is the machine of white supremacy at work. It's never stopped moving forward. It's never been deterred. It's never been paused. It's been the machine of white supremacy at work. And when we have not been looking, it's when it's been working harder. It's only when we turn our attention that they slow down, they pretend it's not happening, but the work is still being done behind the curtain. James Baldwin reminds us that the history is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history. So when they try to erase the history, what they are essentially trying to do is erase us and erase our stories and erase our past, our present, and then work to erase our future. I thought about Mr. Floyd, and then I thought about Mary Turner. Mary Turner was a 21-year-old Black woman, pregnant Black woman, who after publicly denouncing her husband's lynching, she was strung up by her feet, doused with gasoline, and set on fire. Her baby was cut out of her stomach and stomped to death. This happened in 1918. And the same hatred that drove those white men to lynch, burn, and shoot her is the same hatred that led Derek Chauvin to keep his knee on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. It's the same hatred we see being played out in our community on a daily basis. And in thinking about Mary Turner, then I think about the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Black Wall Street, which we're all very familiar with, but one of the most prominent concentrations of Black businesses in the country. 1921, white men in the span of 2 days stalked, tortured, and murdered hundreds of Black people, tossed their bodies into unmarked graves, and then burned a large portion of the town to the ground. They stacked the bodies up and then poured cement over the body and built a highway over where Black bodies were laid to rest with no thought or no concern. That's the kind of deep-rooted hatred that we're talking about. This is a long and well thought out plan at work. It is the erasure of Blackness. It is the erasure of brownness. It is the erasure of trans history from the American agenda that is at work. So what we can do, since we can't outrun our nation's past, we got to confront it. We got to speak up about it. We got to fight against the narrative that our cemeteries are full of nothing but dead bones, rather than cemeteries being full of the hope of who we are to become. We are in a fight right now, and it's to change the hearts and minds and to convince this world that not just that our lives matter, but that we're not going anywhere at this moment. We are reckoning with the past, we're making sense of the present, and then that's when we can prepare our young people for the future. Now, I often talk about South Carolina. I am a native South Carolinian, and I make the argument that when you take a look at what happened in Florida, and you knew that Florida was going to fall under Governor Ron DeSantis, you knew that Florida was going to fall. You take a look at Virginia, you knew Virginia was going to fall. Virginia has been racist to the core ever since they were the capital of the Confederate States of America. Virginia was definitely going to fall when it came to legislation against Black, brown, and the LGBTQIA community, and against legislation that gives women the right to make choices about their pregnancy and about their bodies. So we knew Virginia was going to fall. I made the argument that if Virginia is gone and Florida's gone, all the states in the middle are going to fall one after the other. Because I knew South Carolina, which I would argue is one of the most racist states in this country, as it was in the beginning when they were the first state to succeed from the Union, as it is today. It was South Carolina Senator, political theorist, and plantation owner Robert Calhoun who in 1850 described slavery as a peculiar institution. Now, he believed that slavery was a positive good rather than a necessary evil. He was a staunch defender of white Southern beliefs and practices. Now, it has been almost 175 years almost here. And though it is clear that slavery was indeed a peculiar institution, it was not a necessary evil. It was an unnecessary evil. That the evil that was done and that has been continued over time is only a reminder that the history that we're living in gets rewritten by those who write and control the textbooks. They change the history because we're struggling as a nation to reconcile ourselves with the history and legacy of slavery. We understand that. These are the lofty dreams and ideas around life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which only is available to you if you're white and if you're male, or if you are in cahoots with white men who have power and who believe that Blackness and brownness and people from the LGBTQIA community need to be erased. But this is the moment. And like Angela Davis once said, we must sink deep into the moment. Husband the delight hoarded, because it will be short-lived. What they are experiencing that feels like a victory to them, we understand that though they may win the battle, they will not win the war. And make no mistake about it, folks, we are in a war for the heart and soul of this nation. We're in a war to keep ourselves from being erased in this nation. We are in a war to change the direction of this country. And what we need more now than ever before is we need soldiers. We need truth seekers. We need those who are willing to stand up, not turn back, and not give way. Now is not the time to get tired. I don't think we've ever really had a chance to get tired. I think back to August of 1619, we look at the work that Nicole Hannah-Jones and others put into the 1619 Project. We knew then, when the first 20 and odd Negroes arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, it was not a time to be tired. Now, they did not know their future, but they were clear about their past. They knew who they had come from. They knew what had happened before they got there. That is the historical knowledge that we have to hold on to. That's what they want to erase. If you take away a people's history, then you can figure out where they're going to go. That even if they try to erase us, we have to keep showing up. We have to keep helping this country to learn that things must be reevaluated. At that time in 1619, just a few years later, Ira Berlin said that America moved from being a nation with slaves to being a slave nation, where slavery was at the center of our economy. I want to make a connection between understanding that it's the backs and the blood and tears of Black folks that got us here, and that's not what they want to get rid of. They want us to continue to be worker bees. They just don't want us to be the owners of our own labor. Economist Robert Evans said that the slave market for the antebellum South was similar to the New York Stock Exchange today. because it served in the eyes of the public as a sensitive reflector of current and future business prospects. In other words, if you want to know how the economy's doing, you take a look at how many enslaved people were born that year. How many children did you have growing up? How many enslaved boys were turning 16 and can work harder? How many enslaved girls were turning 13 and can then start having children? It was the New York Stock Exchange. So the market itself was driven by the cost and value of Black bodies. See, Black lives always mattered, and they were always valued even when they told us that they did not. So in 1860, an enslaved man in good health and condition was worth about $1,500. And an enslaved woman, which is a girl of childbearing age, was worth about $13.25. So now let's do the math for just a moment. $1 in 1860 is worth about $33.87 today. So an enslaved man using today's money market was worth about $50,805. And an enslaved woman, childbearing age, which is 13 to 18, was worth about $44,877. So Black bodies have always been valued in this country. And unless one studies this peculiar institution, you struggle with understanding how the current racial climate really fails in trying to figure out how we can collectively move forward without reckoning financially with the past. So that's the complexity of American history. And as educators and activists, we are not surprised that this is happening. We know that it's vital that we raise our collective voices at this moment. It's not simply a debate about curriculum. It is a fight about the direction of this country. And I want to note, as my colleague said earlier, it's not a new fight. It didn't start when Governor DeSantis did his Don't Say Gay bill or his anti-woke campaign, which he has no idea what wokeness is, and the fact that it's an old term that he has been trying to take from us and call it something else. It did not start when Donald Trump labeled CRT, critical race theory, as divisive. It didn't start when he issued an executive order banning racial justice training. It did not even start with the groundbreaking work of the 1619 Project. This is an old battle, and it has its roots in the anti-literacy laws that were passed in Confederate states from 1740 to 1834. It has its roots in the case Roberts v. City of Boston, or the case Plessy v. Ferguson, or the case Roe v. Wade. It has its roots in anti-LGBTQIA discrimination. It has its roots in white supremacy, and in the pursuit of manifest white destiny. So when you begin to look at all the hatred and all the destruction and all the murder and all the inequities and all the violence, you understand that when Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1776 that all men are created equal, he was only talking about him and his boys. Like I said, those are the only men he was talking about. Me and my boys. We're the only ones that are equal in this here country that we made. Because if you look at Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, gender was introduced into the United States Constitution, and being a man meant that you had protected rights. You were only protected if you were, as Thomas Jefferson would put it, one of my boys. Because if you were a man and you were Black, you were not protected. You had no rights. I mean, Dred Scott taught us that. You had no rights that the white man's bound to respect. When the 15th Amendment was ratified 2 years later, prohibiting the federal government in each state from denying a citizen the right to vote based on the citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It said citizen, but it meant men. The ways in which sexual discrimination and sexism are also tied into this discussion that we have to have. And in 1888, when Frederick Douglass argued that no man can either speak or vote or be responsible for a woman, he was one of only a handful of men who spoke out against the universal rule that men actually have control over women. When we say keep your hands out of our womb, this is what we're talking about. No discussion around a debate around curriculum can happen today unless we also include discussions around a debate around our termination and our ability to terminate our pregnancy. Our rights are also at stake, not just as people of color, not just as members of the LGBTQIA community, but by anyone who gender identifies as a woman when they start talking about what we can do with our womb. But before we go down that path, I want to go back just a little bit, back to 1654, because I want to talk about the three battlegrounds that I would argue that we have to fight on. Where does this fight take place? One, this 24-hour teaching, which I am absolutely in support of. I also agree with the work we did on May 3rd as part of the Freedom to Learn. We had a full day teaching. I know work is coming up at ASALA in September, at NWA's conference in October. So the work is going to continue, but we have to think about the battlegrounds, and I would argue that there are three of them. In 1654, as the nation was in the early stages of growth and development, the first documented Black protest happened in America. This is in 1654. 11 enslaved men and women living in the Council of New Netherland, which was later renamed New York, petitioned and won their freedom and their land. See, they had completed 17 of their 18 years of indentured servitude, and they argued that they should be free and not subject to the 1625 Virginia law that was beginning to be adopted in the colonies. Now, that law distinguished between Black servitude and Black slavery, and it laid the groundwork for harsher, more substantial slave laws that took effect beginning in 1657. Now, although that was the first documented racial protest, one could easily argue it couldn't have been the first one ever, and we know it wasn't the last. The earliest account of a rebellion by enslaved people occurred in 1687 on a plantation in Virginia. Now, although the plan was discovered before it fully happened, the idea that Black folks were beginning to plan to aggressively challenge the system must be noted. So like many of you, I have been watching with increased alarm and anger and frustration all the legislation that is being done to limit our academic freedom, to censor the teaching of our history, to talk about how we are being placed in an untenable situation doesn't nearly cover how difficult it is at this moment. This attack is personal. It is rooted in anti-Black racism, in patriarchy. It is rooted in transphobia, whiteness, and xenophobia. It is rooted in all of that. And it's the ways in which we must push back, and we must understand the work that we're doing at this moment must be met full and head on. We are under attack. And as of recent, when we looked at what's happening in North Carolina, we know Florida's gone. We know Virginia is gone. I talked about how South Carolina fell. North Carolina, of course, immediately followed. With their Republican-controlled House, they revisited a previously vetoed proposal, and they voted to restrict how K through 12th grade teachers can discuss racial topics within the classroom. So at this point, we're watching this red wave move across the country. There are more than 40 states at this moment that have either limited how teachers can discuss how race and gender, what is the history of that and how it's happening. They've limited how we can talk about LGBTQIA issues. They've limited the ways in which we can talk about a girl's changing body. They banned the use of this kind of pedagogical methodology in which we open up our history and we have frank discussions with young people about who they are. Now, one of the things that's important to note is that a majority of these bills are so vague and so wide-reaching that what they are essentially doing is they're laying the foundation, what I call breadcrumbs, for future legislative attacks against any academic work, person, or group that critiques this country. See, this is what I mean about the white supremacy machine at work. What they do so well and why it's so effective is that they lay down breadcrumbs. So if they lose ground, they're laying a pathway for the next group of their freedom fighters, because they believe they're fighting for the freedom of this country as well, to come along and pick up the torch and keep it moving forward. The attacks against critical race theory and intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw's brilliant work, coupled with the intentional campaign to reframe wokeness as a veiled threat and a veiled slur against Black and brown people, are the reminders that we need that the classroom is and has always been a contested space. This is why we take a look at these battlegrounds that I mentioned earlier. I want to lay those out in the little time that I have left as we're thinking about how we advance, as we answer these questions around education and about how we go back to the beginning of American history so that we can lay a path for how we go forward. Who has the right to receive an education in this country? Do all people benefit from teaching the complete totality of America's history, no matter how painful it is? Whose history should even be taught? Is Black history American history? Is women's history American history? Is Latina history American history? Is LGBTQIA history American history? Yes to all of it. It is the complete story, the complexity of America that must be taught. We have to be able to look it in the eye, and then we have to address it. And that's why when we take a look at these contested spaces, we know that contesting the spaces in America is a part of what we do well. It happened in 1867 when Carolyn LeConte, who was a freeborn educated woman, when she engaged in civil disobedience and she forced the city to enforce the law that public transportation was supposed to be integrated. It happened in 1851 when Sojourner Truth at the Akron Convention, when she challenged a committee of men to think about the rights of women. And it happened again a year later when Frederick Douglass challenged Americans to think about the significance of the 4th of July. Pushing back is what we do. That's why I'm excited that when I was thinking about being involved with this, the 24 hours that we have here teaching, I'm thinking this is how we push back. We push back both in person, we push back virtually, we find space where we can engage all the way around the country. The first battleground that I would argue is one that must be contested is the white evangelical Christian church. There are ongoing debates and discussions about the role of the church in determining the moral direction of this country. After the recent ruling in the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization Supreme Court decision, that's the court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, politicians have continued to conflate morality, politics, and race. Now, despite the historical understanding of the separation of the church and state, which is loosely grounded in the First Amendment, has been held up by rulings by SCOTUS, the white evangelical church, through both the election of far-right Christian politicians and the appointment of Supreme Court judges, they have continued to expand their political influence. Anthea Butler, in her book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, she writes that evangelicals have defined themselves by their ubiquitous support for the Republican Party and its conservative quest to retain America's status quo of patriarchy, cultural hegemony, and nationalism. Research also shows that the white evangelical Christian consistently deny the existence of structural racism. The surveys by PRRI, which is the Public Religion Research Institute, found that white evangelical Christians are nearly twice as likely to believe that the killings of Black men by the police are isolated events. They're twice as likely to believe that racism is not an issue in this country. They're twice as likely to believe that if we just stick to the teaching of traditional American history, this country will get back on track. That is a battleground where we must fight. The second battleground is the voting booth. Now, in 1965, 1 year after the signing of the Civil Rights Act, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which outlaws discriminatory voting practices, the things my colleague just talked about, literacy tests, poll taxes, the grandfather clause, which was adopted in many Southern states after the Civil Rights. They adopted them into law. Now, this was described as the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. It was designed to enforce the voting rights that were guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendment, which the Supreme Court has expanded 5 times so they can protect it. At the same time, there has been and continues to be a concentrated effort by SCOTUS to limit the scope of the act. It was in 2013 with the Shelby County v. Holder decision that Section 4B of the Act was ruled unconstitutional, giving 9 states located mostly in the South, which is why I don't like going down there, the authority to change their election laws without advanced federal approval. Here's the point that's important to note. 7 of the 9 states, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia were once a part of the Confederacy. As it was in the beginning, so it is today. The final battleground that I offer for your consideration is the classroom, which is what brings us here today. Bell Hooks once said that the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. And as America continued to advance from its early days as a young nation to its current role as a world power, we, those of us that are under attack right now, have continued to contribute to this country. We haven't always benefited from it, but we've continued to contribute. Our struggles and our protests weren't just for land and physical freedom, it was also to have the ability to have access to education for ourselves and for our children. We understand, as Frederick Douglass once said, you teach a person to read. Once you get that in you, this idea that you can be enslaved, and I'm paraphrasing Frederick Douglass, that's not going to ever be a part of how you see yourselves. Reading is a pathway to freedom. Education is a pathway to seeing yourself beyond this moment. There is a tension between where people end up and where they start. And the argument is the place that works out that tension, the place that helps them to figure out where they're going to go, the place that makes it clear to them is the classroom. If you can teach them that only their history matters if they're white, if you can teach them that their history doesn't matter if they're Black or brown, if you can teach them that they have no history if they're LGBTQIA, then you have control over where they're going to end up. This is why we fight. This is why the work we're doing to push back over the classroom, to do exactly what Frederick Douglass says, whether it's trading bread for education, whether it's doing 24-hour teachers, whether it's writing op-eds or demanding that the curriculum be changed, in any case, it's about education. So let me end by telling you a little bit about who I am here for. Who am I standing for? Who am I doing the good work for? I am the president of the National Women's Studies Association, NWSA, the nation's largest network of feminist scholars, educators, and activists. And one of our primary objectives is to promote, support, produce, and disseminate knowledge about women and gender through teaching and learning, research and service, and academic and other settings. We actively draw on feminist scholarship, and we stand squarely in support of intersectionality as a guiding methodology. Now, we are more than just an academic association. We are activists. We are freedom fighters. We are feminists, and we are scholars. We understand that there are times when we must speak up because our silence will never protect us. And if we are not careful, our silence will always appear to be a sign of silent approval. We have never chosen and will never choose to stand with oppressors. We will never request the master's tools to dismantle his house. Instead, we will shape and craft our own tools to burn it down so that something better can be created. We will never eat their crumbs just because they have tried to convince us that we are hungry. We will continue, and we will choose every single time to stand on the side of justice and against those seeking, either because of their fear or their need to control and silence us. We will never stand against those seeking to tear down the racial, social, and gender justice work that has been done in this country. This is our American story. It has been built on disillusion and disappointment, on survival and sacrifice. It is not a new story, nor is it for the faint of heart. America is a beast that prides itself on feeding off of our pain. It is a red, white, and blue nightmare of a tale where Black and brown people exist at the story's edges. What we have to do, and the way that we push forward, is we understand that in this country, as my Nana said, when you look at the heart of people in this country, you start to realize it's not just that they were raised to be racist. No, no, no. They were raised on moonshine and white supremacy. They were raised on whiteness, hog maw, and fatback. And what gets me every time is understanding that the same America that they live in is the America that we live in. And just like they get to control the future, we get to pull the future back from their hands and we get to reshape it. We are at a moment now where what we're doing, I believe that history has its eye on us. And we've got to determine at this moment the kind of America that we want to live in. In closing, I just want to say that I believe, and I have found it to be true, that America, even though I love this country, I love the fact it's so complex. I'm like, James Baldwin, it's because I love America that I can so fiercely critique her. America is a country that is racist to the core. It is a system that oppresses us. It is the knee on our neck. It holds us down. It pins us down. It makes it so hard for us to breathe, but we've got to be willing, as we are doing tonight, to stand up for freedom. Coretta Scott King said that freedom is really never won. You've got to earn it and win it in every generation. And Ella Baker said that we who believe in freedom cannot rest. And Angela Davis said you have to act as if it was possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. And Malcolm X said, if you're not willing to die for freedom, take it from your vocabulary. My Nana, who was one of the first Black nurses in South Carolina, said that Black people are born fighting to breathe, and they live fighting to survive. America is indeed a racist country. That is not new, but we will change it. It's a hellfire, but we can extinguish it. It is a snake with multiple heads. We can cut each one of them off. We can transform this country. We can transmogrify this country, because at this critical moment, as Asada Shakur once said, we have nothing else, I would add. She said nothing to lose but our chains. I would say nothing else to lose but our chains. If we give on those three spaces, the classroom, that white evangelical church, and the voting booth, when we give on those spaces, then we are essentially giving up our space at the table. And we can never do that. We can't give up the space that people who came before us died to make sure that we have. Thank you so much. I'm Dr. K. Wise Whitehead, president of the National Women's Studies Association, a professor at Loyola University, Maryland in Baltimore.
Dr. Wise Whitehead, you just set a standard here. All right. And as president of the National Women's Studies Association, I mean, the way that you brought this fire, this wisdom, this truth, just on behalf of all of us, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.